I just have a little bit of cannabis and just like dive into the editing vortex and put headphones on, like lay in the sun, and it's I love it. Like getting the right music, getting the right tone, and it can get pretty fun. But I noticed that the more stoned I got, the more I started fucking around with all these features I didn't need to
Yes, I
do.
resonate with that, man. It's like you just get sucked into the creative process until you start tinkering, and then all of a
Oh
sudden you're
man.
in the
I
wormhole.
was like, I wonder what happens. I wonder what that button does. And it's like a whole new world of like filters that you can add on, like screen flares and like 1970s style effects. And I'm like, oh, I wonder what happens if I mix this with that.
Welcome to Birdsong with your host, Kayuta Kiora, exploring all things related to the path of shamanism, nature-based spirituality, truth-seeking, storytelling, awakening, health and wellness, earth-honoring traditions, ceremony, ritual, rites of passage, and of course, a remembering of the sacred ways. Hey everyone, it's Caillou here. Welcome to another episode of Birdsong. And in this particular conversation, we have Jiro Taylor joining us. Jiro, what have I got to say about Jiro? Well, he's a mystic, he's a poet, a storyteller. He facilitates wilderness rites of passage. He's an artist, a creative, and a mentor to those seeking deeper connection with their soul path and their wild wisdom within. The work that he is involved in honors ancient wisdom and flows through into modern life through art, nature-based mentoring programs, wilderness quests, with the greater intention to help individuals remember who they are. He is the founder of Shambhala Warriors and the Flowstate Collective. And look, I consider him to be an all-round great guy, stepping into the role of wise sage and seer in the larger community. And to me, he's both a comrade and a teacher in many ways. Now, this particular conversation gets a little bit glitchy at times, and we did have a dropout earlier on, which I've edited to some degree to keep the flow, but overall our dialogue is ripe and ready for your listening ears, and we cover a lot of fertile ground here, from nature immersion, from being domesticated beings and transitioning into a place of remembering, reconnecting, rewilding to our roots, the roots of who we are as earthly beings, learning from the ground on which we stand and all of our relations in all their different manifestations, from the two-legged, the four-legged, the winged, the scaly, the mycelial networks, the canopied foliage above, the flowing rivers, the rocks and mountains, and the whispering winds. We talk about ways in which we can cultivate that deeper connection to nature, similarities between various wisdom traditions. We talk about soul language, language of the earth. We riff on shamanism, on how the mind is not exclusively a human possession, but extends out to the entirety of our environment, mind of place, spirit of place, and a lot of other ideas. And look, some of these ideas, these ways of living and breathing, well, I haven't articulated them with great depth before. So keep that in mind as I try to flesh out some of these oral imaginings and thought forms in the present moment unfolding of our conversation here. So I trust you'll enjoy this dialogue. It was a real pleasure welcoming Jiro onto the show. Let's get straight into it. Thanks for being here, and I trust you'll find value in our dialogue to carry with you on your own path forward. Well, look, let's not beat around the bush. Let's get straight into it, Jiro. Welcome to Birdsong, brother. Thanks for being here on the show today.
Thank you very much, man. A pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it looks delightful wherever you are. I can see outside the car window anyway. It looks like the sun is shining down and you got foliage in the backdrop. So look, before we get into the heart of things, give us a little bit of an update on where you are at right now. And what's the time? It's just after 10 a.m. The sun's shining down where I am. It's frosty though. A thin layer of ice is covering a lot of what's outside. So I'd love to know what constitutes a typical morning for you in your life as well.
So I'm on the sunny coast of Australia, which is 2 hours north of Brisbane. It's a subtropical kind of zone, and yeah, I live in a very beautiful place where there's lots of rainforest, but there's also coast. And my life is quite a dance between the forest and the ocean. And every day I'm either in the forest or the ocean. Um, so after this, I'm going to go to the ocean because the surf's up. And yeah, a typical morning for me is pretty much like the morning I've just had. I get up fairly early. It ranges between sort of 5 and 6 that I get up. Um, and I either go straight into a meditation or a nature sit spot where I just sit quietly, listening. This morning I jumped onto a Zoom call, so I got into my mobile podcast studio here and drove somewhere where there's better reception than at my cabin, and jumped onto a Zoom call with some of the brothers who are on my Shambhala Warrior program, and then came home, charged the laptop, and ate a smoothie prepared by my beautiful wife, and then jumped on this.
Perfect. Yeah, that's something that I would love to touch on a little bit later down the track, the Shambhala Warrior program that you put together, and amongst many other threads. But one of the first gateways that I would love to enter with you, and look, this is perhaps one of the most fundamentally important gateways in both of our lives, and that is honoring the sacred. You know, we both know whether it's making an offering of gestures, thoughts, tobacco, prayers, intentions, gratitude, we're invoking in something specific. It could be song, poem, whatever it is. We're typically giving something when we find ourselves entering, or we feel as though we're entering a ceremonial or ritualistic container or sacred space. So in honor of our time together, I would love to invite you to share something, whatever you feel is coming through, to open up our time and space together in light of honoring the sacred.
Beautiful. I'll share a little story that I read last night. Okay, so I've been reading a book called Women Who Run with Wolves, which is a book apparently for women, but it's also for men, and it's full of stories. Okay, so once upon a time, a beautiful angel, paid a visit to 4 rabbis in their sleep, in their dream state. And this angel transported these rabbis to the 7th chamber of the 7th heaven. And in that chamber of the 7th heaven, the angel revealed Ezekiel's wheel, his tetrahedron, his interdimensional travel device, which is a super sacred and powerful kind of like portal that some people have journeyed inside in meditations. But in a certain traditions, this is regarded as like a vehicle through which different dimensions are traveled to. And these rabbis were taken on a guided tour of this tetrahedron, this portal. The first rabbi, he started foaming at the mouth the next day and just went crazy. He just couldn't handle the potency of the download that he had just received. The second rabbi took on a very cynical stance and was like, no, it was just a dream. It was just a dream. There was nothing there. The third rabbi became obsessed with it, the facts and the figures and the measurements of this thing, and he couldn't shut up about it. And he spent the rest of his days telling people all about how fast this thing went and how big it was and how amazing it was. And the fourth rabbi got a piece of paper and a pen and just spent the rest of his days writing poetry and writing songs in honor of the beautiful sacred divinity that he had just experienced. And I share that story to talk about, it touched me in a way of like how we experience the ineffable, how we experience the divine, how we experience the sacred, whether that's a forest or an ocean or a conversation like this. And there's a way of experiencing it that just transcends the measurements and the facts and the figures and the literal and it, you enter the mythos, the mythical, the poetic, the realm of the imagination. And it's almost like we're entering the territory of the soul, and we're speaking the language of the soul. And so yeah, that story just touched me, and I felt to bring it into this conversation. Yeah, just to talk about how our art and creativity and our offerings is is the way in which we can convey the unconveyable, the
Mm.
the divine.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, I love that, Jiro. I have read that book as well. And while the title suggests that it is for women, yes, I couldn't have said it better myself. It is certainly not just for women. And it is a book that is rich with stories and rich with wisdom, and a way for both men and women to open up their perspective. And there are so many books like this that I have been immersing myself within, and I feel like many of the stories and many of the well, I guess they are. Many of the stories, the mythos, I feel like I've been carried by these lately. And this is something that Leon Cossar, we just had a conversation for the show the other day. This is something that he offered a reframe around. I've been sitting with this question of how can I best honor the life that I live? How can I best honor the sacred within each and every day? What is it that I'm carrying with me? As in, what are my gifts? What are my medicine that I'm carrying with me to be in service to offer the world? And the reframe that he offered me was, well, what is it and who is it that is carrying you? What's been carrying you? And feeling into this reframe, it's like, okay, yeah, I can see how all these stories, all these myths, these are the things that have been carrying me in such a profound way lately.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, I mean, I've been on the same journey, and as you know, Leon's a dear brother of mine, and I'm so happy to see him on your show. And the last couple of years, yeah, I've been really dropping into story and myth, and Leon's been pivotal in my life for that. Really rehydrating this ancient knowing exists within me. But yeah, that's an interesting one. Carrying the stories, being the medicine carrier, being the story carrier, but also being carried by the stories, being held by the stories. Yeah, where have you got to in your inquiry with that?
So, what I am sitting with at the moment is an integration of these two. I think it's a feedback loop. Perhaps it's cyclical. So, what is it that is carrying me, and in turn, what am I carrying? So, in the context of what we're talking about here, stories and myths, I have been asking myself, what are the stories that have been carrying me, and what stories am I carrying? And we can interchange any particular word or vernacular in there. What medicine has been carrying me? What medicine am I carrying? And it's something that I'm still sitting with. It's not something that I really have articulated out into the world with all that much depth. I've just been ruminating on it on a very superficial level. And it's something that perhaps requires a little bit of time with pen to paper to really flesh out my ideas around this on a greater level. Is it something that has come into your radar, this concept? Taking advantage of this quick little technical difficulty, what I want to also mention here is when we're talking about what is it or who is it that's carrying us, that part of this is directly speaking to the long lineage of ancestry behind us. It's speaking to the giants whose shoulders we stand upon, the immediate ones and the ancient ones that have paved the path for us to be here today. So, in saying that, something that I forgot to say during our conversation, let's get back to it. Welcome back. Technical difficulties.
Yeah. Am I coming through clear?
Yeah, I can see you, I can hear you, we're all good.
Okay, man.
Where'd you get up to? Did you catch the gist of what it was portraying there?
So basically it cut off just after you said that you're working through an integration of the two, and it cut off pretty early in that piece.
Yeah, look, I was saying that we could interchange any particular word there, or at least I feel like that's something that I've been musing on. What stories have been carrying me? What stories am I carrying? What medicine has been carrying me? But what medicine am I also carrying? And I was just saying that I haven't really articulated it out in the open with much depth or clarity at all. So perhaps it's something that requires a little bit of time with pen to paper to really gain some more coherence and clarity to what it is that I'm actually musing on.
Yeah.
And I was just posing the question back to you to ask whether this is anything that you have reflected on yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, being carried by the stories. Over the last couple of weeks or months, I've been really engaging in a concerted effort to practice sitting in nature, in silence, and just returning to the same spot, and coming back actually in different times of day, and really really getting to know, really building up a relationship with the plants and the creatures in this particular forest, and developing a sense of intimacy, and just tracking over a period of weeks the shifts in, obviously there's a shifts in my own awareness of what's going on, but there's also a shift that I feel in terms of how I'm received by the plants and the creatures all around me. And so this feeling of being part of an unfolding story that is just life has really become enhanced. I think that one of the traps, or one of the conditions of having this type of mind that we have, and the culture that we have, which has been built around this type of mind that we have, is this kind of individualism and this perspective that we get, where essentially the world revolves around us, and we see ourselves as separate from it and engaging with it. But man, when you spend hours and days and weeks just sat on a fallen tree with your feet on the earth, and you become you really do melt into the myth of the earth. You melt into the unfolding of life, and the colors and the sounds and the resplendence. And yeah, this notion of being carried by the song of the earth, of being part of the song lines, this has become really resonant for me. It's just that every breath, every thought, every song that comes through me, it's of the earth. When I'm sharing, it's of the earth. And so I feel it is all collapsed, that the medicine that we carry is also carrying us. It's a perfect manifestation of this torus kind of shape, or this like the ancient Hermetic philosophy of as below, so above. It's just, yeah, it's both happening at the same time.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, this is something that I would love to deepen into with you. And what you're speaking to is something that we have been both deepening into for many, many moons. It's the nature immersion, but it's much more than just immersing oneself in nature. I feel as though it's returning to our wild animal nature, to the wild wisdom within. It's recognizing and embodying this felt sense, knowing that yes, from perhaps a spiritual perspective, we're unity consciousness and spiritual beings, cosmic entities, but from a day-to-day experiential level, we're bound to the earthly. Our feet are planted in the ground with the microbes and with the decomposing leaf litter, and we with the earthworms and the roots, and we feel the wind against our skin, and we can hear the kookaburras off in the distance and behold them sitting on the distant gum trees. So there's this real tangible, visceral, sensory feeling of the rain splashing down on our skin. It's as real, and it's from this place that we are connecting to our animal essence, and that we can start to expand our consciousness, stretch our perception, our earthly perception, to become aware of the subtleties that we perhaps once had but have been lost to the sands of time because of this thing that you're speaking to, the domestification of humans.
Yeah, man, it's you're speaking my language, and that's really beautifully put. And yeah, I do feel like a big part of my work, and I feel a sense of responsibility to really like adding depth and texture to this kind of trite notion of nature connection. People often talk about nature connection, and it's almost like when people talk about gratitude, sometimes these things in our zeitgeist can take on this air of cliche, or they become sort of like weakened, or it's like it's a heading in the right direction, but it never really plunges to the depths of what it really, really, really means. And so what you and I understand as nature connection, it's words like eros and intimacy and romance. We're talking about a relationship here, rather than a walk in the woods. We're talking about courting the wild, as Leon and Martin Shaw would say. We're talking about shifting from one night stands and cheap dates to like deep emergent relationships over years and years and years and years. And yeah, it's such a profound part of my life. And I feel like when I think about what's important, what's like really important, what path to tread, what to teach people, what does the world need to know, what do our children need to know, what do the politicians need to know, what do the heads of the corporations need to know, like how do we shift from a culture that's rapacious and extractive and non-regenerative to a culture that is in harmony and synchrony and synergy with the earth, which is what we all want. Well, then what you're talking about is so necessary and so powerful. And it's the personal journey of shifting from a walk in the woods, or to actually like unfurling one's sensory intelligence. Almost like the image that I'm getting in my mind as I talk is like the unfurling of these kind of like all of these kind of like invisible organs that we have, and they're all reaching out to connect with nature in different ways, kind of like the way that the avatar connects with his flying beast through that cord he has. It's like our senses are like that. We have all these different ways of connecting in with the wild, but because of the particular traits of our culture, it's like the mental and the visible has been really strongly trained, and the other senses have just kind of like they're withering and they're dying away. And so yeah, I'm so passionate about this subject, man. I'm so passionate about nature connection. And it's my teacher, man. It's my main path. It's true and it's solid. And I think like if you zoom out and think about what's going on in the world right now, just in terms of mass events which create a sense of panic and sometimes hysteria and certainly polarization, and people are being swayed into different types of opinion and thinking, and there's lots of ideological labels, and it's even more important that we learn to remember what we are on this deep, innate, wild dimension that is just so much more, it's so much more ancient and more real than any of these other kind of like identifiers. And I find solace in the fact that it's true. It's like the sun, the moon, the seasons. There's a solidness there that allows that allows this sense of unfurling, or this like peacefulness on a very, very deep level. Very, very deep level. So when we're talking about peacefulness and calm and harmony, and we know that for what we want out there in the world, it has to begin within. Well, nature's just always just calling us into that, man. So yeah, I'm pretty passionate about this whole reconnecting with the wild thing.
Yeah, for sure. You and I both. Well, let's riff on this a little bit more. What do you feel like you could articulate right now when it comes to the ways that you have been cultivating this connection that we're speaking to with the wild? Because as we both know, there are, well, like you spoke, well, we both spoke to, there's the superficial surface level act of just going out and bathing oneself in nature, sitting out in nature, yeah, connecting in that way. But we know that there are a bunch of techniques that can help us retune our animal senses to everything that's around us. So what can you speak to about
Yeah.
that?
Well, I'll take it back to the story of the four rabbis. There's the one who's just overwhelmed by the awesomeness of the divine, and he's just like goes incoherent. And then there's one who's just like cynical about the awesomeness of the divine, and it's like he's just like that cynical person, right? Who's just like the energy of skepticism. And then there's the person who just gets overwhelmed by the facts and the figures and the measurableness of it all. And he gets obsessed with names of plant species and numbers and when things were discovered and stuff like that. And then there's the person who writes love songs and poems about nature, about the wild. And so this is a beautiful part of my practice, which goes hand in hand with my, it goes in perfect tandem with my plant medicine journeys and experiences. Ever since I've been journeying with plant teachers, I've been writing love songs back to Pachamama and back to life. And it's almost as though the nature, the wild, the earth, the way I perceive it anyway, it's like sometimes I'm having these experiences where I'm just like mind blown by the sheer variety of fruit or birds, like, or the different types of trees and grasses, or the different shades of green, or the colors of a rainbow. And I'm just like completely in awe of the abundance of it all. And then I realized Mother Earth is basically just like modeling for us like how to live. And she's basically saying like, look how much I give. There's just more. You don't need that many types of mango. Right? We don't need this many. It's like, come on. Like one would do you fine. But instead there's like an abundance, and there's all these different flavors and these different experiences and these different types of snowfall and wind and all these sorts of things. And I'm just like, that is what I'm receiving. So I am honor bound, duty bound to give back from that same kind of place, from that same well of abundance and diversity and colorfulness and vibrancy. So my practice is to give back to life itself through prayer, through song, through offerings, through simple acknowledgements. For example, every time I enter the ocean these days, for the last 6 or 7 years, there's a very sacred, solemn moment before I enter the ocean where I'm connecting with the spirit of water, and I'm asking for permission and blessings on entering this divine body of water, and it's just basic respect, but it just wasn't part of my upbringing. Another example is the moon. I'd say that my relationship with the moon has really deepened in the last year or so, and that's why is that? It's simply because I had a moment where I made a decision that I wanted to have a deeper relationship with the moon. And so what do you do when you want to have a deeper relationship with something or someone? You talk to it, you communicate, you make sure that you show up, you open up a conversation. And so over the last year, every time there's a full moon, anytime I become conscious of the moon, I stop and I open up a conversation with the moon, and something really magical started to happen with my relationship with the moon. Because before I began this process, of course, I had read lots about, La Luna, like how it's like Mama Kia, they call it in the Andes, and and of course I'd read books about how the moon is sort of like got this feminine energy, and it's got this correlation to women's cycles and the tides and the water. And so I had all this in my mind, but yet there was still something like where it hadn't dropped deep into my deep knowing yet. And I had to actually cultivate my own relationship with the moon before it dropped into that deep knowing. It couldn't just be reading books and poems and hearing other people's stories. And as I developed this continual, consistent communication with the moon, where I began to court it, walk outside every night and spend time with the moon, looking at her, feeling the energy from her, it began to become part of my experience that, yes, this is a maternal, feminine energy. Yes, this is like, I am having a feeling of being held and being listened to here. So that's just every time I now look at the moon or glance at the moon or even think about the moon, I've created this response. There's a feeling of joyfulness, and there's a feeling of maternal nurturing that I instantly feel whenever I just glance at the moon. And that's just one of the celestial beings. That's just one of the profound gifts that we have in nature. And I perceive how there's, with trees, and my relationship with the sun has also deepened in a similar way to the moon. It's just like, it's basically to do with how much consciousness and what type of consciousness we choose to direct towards anything that we choose. That's where I've come to.
Yeah, I love it. There's so many points in there, like the consistency piece. That is super important, and you already touched on that before. You cannot just be a weekend voyager dipping in. It's that consistency, that building of that relationship, like you say, and like Leon and like Dr. Martin Shaw would say, courting nature. It's courting like a lover, singing songs and telling stories of place. And you speak to, and this is another point, another important point as well that you touch on, sharing stories and letting nature speak through us. So in one sense, it's speaking about nature, but we can't forget that other point as well, which you've touched on, which is speaking to nature. Yeah, it's recognizing that, it's recognizing this animistic quality to life, that everything carries its own essence. And when I say everything, I'm talking about the animate, the inanimate, but more than that, it's our vocalizations, our intonations, our verbalizations. They're all vibrations that carry this essence of us into the greater sphere, which to me, and as you know, to many, yourself and many other nature-based cultures and shamanic cultures, has a very real effect on all of life around us when we're speaking to nature.
Mm-hmm.
Many of these things which have become so everyday and so common sense, at least to the way that I'm making sense of the world, it seems so simplistic, but because we have been so disconnected from these ways of living and breathing for such a long time, they seem so foreign and so alien to a large pocket, a large patch, just a very a lot of the collective mindset, a lot of the collective consciousness. And perhaps that's a bit of an obsession as well, being obsessed with only the mindset. And I can't remember the way that you articulated it in one of your videos a while back, but I loved what you had to say about the mindset being like the banks of the river.
Yeah. What I was tuning into in that video is that there's a lot of energy in our culture being directed towards the mind. Obviously, that's the understatement of the year. And one of those tributaries is this concept of mindset, or people cultivating mindset, mental peak performance training your mind, developing your mind, and which is all awesome, valid. Like I am a big proponent of shaping my mind and becoming aware of the patterns of my mind. But what I began to perceive is that the mind is no more the river than the riverbanks. No, the mind. It's like, what I'm trying to say is, like, the mind is like the riverbanks, right? It's like, it's not the actual river. The river itself is information and energy. So the mind is actually like an instrument through which something flows. And what seems to be flowing through the mind is information and energy. It's all energy, right? And so I began to perceive how this cultural obsession with mindset is kind of like an obsession with like shaping riverbanks, but never actually paying any attention to upstream. Like what about the water? What about the glacial riverhead, the source of what's coming in? And so the beautiful thing about how nature unfolds is that a when rivers flow, when there's big rains or rivers flow, like nature will see to it. The contours are already there to be, nature has her contours and her valleys through which the water flows, right? And you got humanity in this culture just obsessing about creating like the contours and the patterns and the set of the mind, and paying no attention to the source upstream of the beautiful power, the beautiful divinity, the beautiful wisdom and consciousness that, if it was just let flow, it would shape our neural pathways in such beautiful ways. We wouldn't really need to worry about it. And of course, we could like shore up the banks, and we could like become aware of certain perceptions and belief systems, and we could shape, lay some more foundations there to shape. But really, if we just let nature take its course and just connect to the source again and again and again, stay connected to the source, then pretty sure that this thing called mindset wouldn't really need to be worried about.
Yeah, even the word, it's a bit funny, isn't it? Mindset. It's set. It's rigid.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, it gets me thinking, what else is set in regards to, well, yeah, when I'm thinking about what else is set and what else is rigid in regards to what we're talking about, the information that we're exposed to, and where I'm going with this is that the information that we are exposed to and that's kind of found its way into the dominant culture and society it's all fixed, as in it's fixed on page, or it's fixed on a computer screen, or it's fixed through the data and the analysis and everything that we are fed in one way or another. It just seems like that's the dominant stream that's coming through. And because of this way of gaining or receiving information that we've become so accustomed to, we've lost this sense of face-to-face recognition, or face-to-face storytelling, face-to-place recognition as well. I'm not sure if you're familiar with these concepts. This is something that David Abram talks about in Becoming Animal. That when we're in front of the screens, or we've got the headphones in our ears, or reading text off a book, we've lost something very, very important, which is that connection, that immediacy to place, because we're not immersed in this immediacy of nature, deep nature connection that we're speaking to. And where I'm kind of trying to weave myself as I articulate something that I probably haven't articulated before, it's like what happens on the level of the mind when we're engaging in these particular ways of receiving information. We're only reading the books, or we're only looking at the computer screens. It's like we're losing this sense that the mind is not exclusively a property of what's happening inside here, what's happening inside our skulls. Mind is a property of everything around us. This is like it's not more really an idea. You could say it's an idea, but it's more a way of living and breathing that I've been really trying to enmesh myself in more of late. That yes, while there are aspects of mind that resides in the head, mind also lives in the body. And internal mind is also shaped by external mind. So we're always participating in mind of place, or we could call it spirit of place as well. And we could look at each individual as having properties of uniqueness, of sovereignty. In one sense, but ultimately all individuals are playing their part in affecting each other and being affected by each other, which forms greater and greater complexities of mind, not just mind within, but mind without. Is this kind of making sense to you on one level? what
Yeah.
I'm getting at?
Yeah.
So, yeah, the individuals, the life forms, as I spoke to before, they're not just the animate, as we both know. They're the rocks, the rivers, the mountains, the streams, the ground beneath our feet. And there's the conceptual ruminations that we could feel into. And that's something that, of course, we could talk about more in depth. It's the conceptual knowing of this. And then there's the experiential, the embodiment, which is way more important than just getting all wrapped up just in the rational, logical mind. But it's getting back to the soil. It's retuning our human ears to animistic ways of living that has been finding a real importance in the depth, the marrow of my bones for many moons now. And it just seems to be the roots. I can feel the roots taking greater hold within the soil of my being. I know this is something that you can speak to and that you feel on a very embodied experiential level too.
Yeah. Leon's often dropped the word in rehydrating something, rehydrating the mythos, the mythic imagination, and I've been really dropping into what you're talking about recently, and I feel like I'm on a emerging frontier of remembering a dimension of intelligence that I had begun to forget about because of the way that I've been brought up. And so basically what I've been understanding is that we have this mythic intelligence. We have this dimension of our intelligence that I would call it the language of the soul, or the intelligence of the soul, right? And it's very different from what would get measured in an IQ test. Very interestingly, someone the other day was telling me that Aboriginal Australians score very low on average on IQ tests. And this person wasn't being derogatory or racist or anything like that. This person was simply, we were pointing to what the IQ test measures, because I've hung around Indigenous Australians and they are light years ahead of me in certain dimensions of knowing and intelligence, right? And so it begs the question, well, what is an IQ test measuring, right? And so an IQ test is measuring the stuff that our culture tells us is intelligence. And it's all to do with, look at our culture. We have cities that are straight lines and grids. We go to classrooms where students are in rows and there's a bell, and we have disproportionate amount of emphasis put on scientific peer-reviewed research, and we have an almost a shocking level of just not only ignorance, but actually on a cultural level, but denial of the infinite, the mystery, the unmeasurable, the unknowable. And it's almost like it's denied that dimension even exists, because of course it represents the big abyss, the big black hole, and it's fearful to a culture that is built upon control and conquering and claiming and knowing everything and making everything finite. So me being I was born into this culture, you as well, or everybody listening, of course we've gone through a process of heavy conditioning, gnarly conditioning, so gnarly that we don't even, we're going to spend the rest of our lives unconditioning the parts of ourselves that have been conditioned in all these subtle ways. And part of this conditioning has been revealed to me beautifully in the last couple of years by the simple realization that, shit, man, when someone began telling a story, sometimes I just couldn't follow it. I couldn't listen to the story. The story couldn't land in me. I began to realize that there's a skill to listening to a story, to listening to myth, to reading poetry. And I began to realize that this skill it's almost like this. It's a new way of perceiving self and other and life and nature, and it's almost like imagine you had like a 2D flat thing, and then all of a sudden you could blow into it and it goes, when it like blows up into a multi-dimensional type of thing. It's almost like my imagination had become flattened and 2D, right? And as these stories, as these ancient myths, me hanging around with indigenous fellas and listening to Dreamtime stories and watching them dance and going on hunting journeys and learning like stories that are 20,000, 30,000 years old, this flattened imagination began to just like open up until I began to perceive the craziness of that the imagination had been flattened in the first place, right? And I've begun to see how the effect of this flattened imagination in my relationships, in the way that I communicate with people. I'll give you a very brief example of just like, you know, we all, most of us are in relationships with someone, an intimate relationship, and for me anyway, my relationship with my wife is one of the primary mirrors to understand how I show up and so forth. And
For sure.
yeah, and I began to realize that sometimes I'm speaking to my wife in really black and white rational ways, you know, like, or I'm speaking to other people in really black and white rational. I'm speaking to myself in really linear black and white ways that are quite like sharp. And I'm like, and I'm looking at the outside world, you know, like this event that's going on with in America, Black Lives Matter and so forth. And it's like, everybody's seeing this literally in black and white terms, literally. And they're seeing it as like, there's that side and there's this side. And it's like it's basically a really profound reduction of multidimensionality to like the thinness of polarity, like the thinness of like a two-dimensional thing. And we all do it in the way that we perceive ourselves. We all do it in the way that we perceive others. And I've noticed that as I enhance my multidimensional mythic intelligence, I began to be able to perceive myself, global events, my wife, my relationship with how I communicate in a completely different way. It's textured and nuanced and soft, and it's like instead of like the sharp noise of a mechanical chainsaw sound, it's more akin to like the crunch of leaves underfoot and the sound of birds. You know, there's like a naturalness to it, instead of it being like sterile and harsh and brittle, which is kind of like where that kind of like non-mythical imagination takes us to. It's been a big journey for me, man, and I'm still learning how to rehydrate, and it feels like water's flowing into like barren riverbeds, and it's like there's new life sprouting in parts of my body that have like been yearning for this, and it's resulting in a sense of belonging. That's really where it leads to, is this really profound sense of belonging. I feel like I belong. I am part of the song of the earth. I am a creature of the sun. And I feel like, just to go back to where the world's at and why this shit is important, brother, 99.9% of people just don't feel they belong. There's no sense of belonging. They're like aliens here. And so obviously, because there's no sense of belonging, they have to cling to this identity of I am a this, I am a that, I am a left this, I am a, and it all stems from this fundamental loss of a more raw, deep belonging, a belonging to the earth. And so I'm learning how myth and poetry and storytelling, they're like calls back to belonging, back to this ancient remembrance that we are it, that we are life incarnate.
Yeah, you're speaking my language, brother. Soul language.
Yeah, bro.
I love this idea that if we want to come to some sort of restoration, in a sense, you know, there's restoration in many different ways, of the ancient ways, of the wild ways, of restoration to self, to land, to our wild roots, then we need restoration. Restoration, restoration. Yeah. We need to be telling different stories to the ones that we're currently telling. We need to be finding the many different stories like you speak to, instead of just seeing the polarity, the black and the white. We need to be finding or developing, cultivating new ways of receiving and listening to stories. And, it actually reminds me of something that I heard Stephen Jenkinson say. So in this particular video, he touched on the word rewilding, and this might be an interesting little portal for us to dive into. So when we use this, I guess you'd call it a prefix, re, so we're talking about restoration, rewilding, remembering. He was making the point that it's alluding to something that we've personally perhaps once had. And it's an interesting point that he makes, because on an individual level, perhaps we're not actually redoing something in this particular incarnation, because if we haven't done it before experientially, he makes this comment that it's kind of laughable in a sense that we're redoing anything on an individual level. But I'm not sure if I really agreed with his sentiments, as wise of a man as I perceive him to be, but because I think we can zoom out and look at it from a collective level, that we can get back to our roots, which is that connection to the land, to the soil beneath our feet. So we could say that this knowing, this remembering, it's while it may not be in this physical incarnation, if we haven't had an experiential knowing of that, then where am I going with this? Look, the essence of it is still, it's waiting in the unconscious mind, and there's something within our cellular memory. As I said before, it's in the marrow of our bones. So it's waiting for us to tap back into. And if we can go from wild to, if we can go from being so connected to the wild to being so domesticated in such a short period of time in the grand scheme of things, then it's interesting to think how quickly we could return back to some essence of the wild, or be carried by that essence into something new. And perhaps the prefix of redoing anything is pointing not to backtracking, in a sense, to something that was before, but we could see it as tapping into exactly what you were speaking to before. The cyclical nature of all things, the ebb and flow, the contraction, the expansion, the constant spiraling and circling essence within all of life, great and small. So
yeah, that's certainly how I see it. I don't see it as rather than seeing it as like some great macro shift from domesticated to wildness. I don't see it as that. I see it as a minute to minute, second to second, daily remembering, because there is such a profound forgetfulness that is constantly part of my experience as being a human being with an identity and a personhood in this culture. So that's, I completely agree with you. It's perpetual, it's constant, this journey of remembrance, I find.
Something that you touched on before, brother, when it comes to all of these different experiences that you've had regarding these different paths, these different traditions, teachings, ways of learning, whether it's the the nature-based spirituality, or the shamanism, which I'd love to touch on shortly as well, or your time spent studying Zen Buddhism, if my memory serves me correctly. Or there's the wilderness vigil, the vision quest, your time with the Yolngu people up north of Australia, or any other experience for that matter. What have you got to share when it comes to reflecting on all of these pathways, all these experiences? And look, I'm just going to throw you the ball there and just take that wherever you want it. You can talk about similarities, the differences. You can weave in this idea of the pathless path that I've heard you speak to before.
Yeah, man.
Yeah.
Oh man, yeah. I'm really, first of all, I'm just really in honor of myself for calling in all these experiences, and I really love that. I've had a life so far where I've gone deep into various rabbit holes, and at an early age, once I left the family home, it was straight to Japan, where I was diving into both my ancestry, because I'm half Japanese, and also diving into Zen Buddhism. and this is like really, it's deep in there. That's where I learned how to meditate. That's where I first learned about so many concepts, from enlightenment to just the fact that we have choice, to choose our experience. And so over the years, as you said, I've become very interested in shamanic traditions, and spent a lot of my time in the wilderness, and working with plants and so forth. And over the past couple of years, a more recent kind of like shift on the journey has been into in the initiation practices, rites of passage, and that led me to doing a lot of work in vision questing, nature-based vigils, wilderness quests, and then I've spent a little bit of time, not a lot of time, just a couple of weeks with the Yongle people up in northeast Arnhem Land, with Kate and Sam from Nature Philosophy, who are epic humans who go there every year and take people up there, and they've been going there for 11 years. And the thing that comes up for me is just the connectiveness of all these experiences. Like there's just, and one of my rabbit holes that I love going into is like religion and pre-religious mysticism, and like what's beneath modern day Judaism and modern day Islam and modern day Christianity, like what's beneath there, and reading about the Kabbalah and then like reading into Mayan cosmology and so forth, and Egyptian cosmology. And I'm just always blown away by the oneness, the deep commonalities within all these wisdom traditions, and it strikes me that myth and religion, which is, you could say is just like collections of myths, so religion and myth are all of the earth. They're of the earth. Like if you ask any storyteller worth his salt, and you ask him where did that story come from, he'll probably answer that it came from a place. It came from a place, like as you were talking about before. It came from a place, and that place is of the earth. So all of these, I mean, that the concept of a song line, like, which is a Australian Aboriginal concept. It's basically like a kind of like a multi-dimensional map, pilgrimage journey, but it's basically of the earth. It's wisdom that's coming of the earth. It's guiding us. And so I'm just constantly blown away how humanity has complicated all these things and put all these different sorts of labels and created divisions over all these things, and you're this and I'm that, but it's all the same thing. It's just all of the earth, and there's some primordial wisdoms in there, and it's all about the fact that we live in this universe where there is there's this paradox of separateness and oneness, right? And that's captured in all of these traditions. And so one thing that came to mind when you asked me about my experience with the Aboriginal people, I'll just share a brief little bit of story about that time up there, because this is the first time that I've lived in Australia for a decade, and it took me a while for it to be on my radar, to go and hang out with people who are living in old ways. And then it took some time for me to prepare, and anyway, it took me 10 years before I actually sat down with people who are originally from this land. And I think that 10 years was necessary for me to actually get to the stage, get to the type of consciousness where I could actually like have an experience, where I could meet this experience with some sense of maturity. And even still, I met the experience, and it bamboozled me and walloped me, and to the point where I couldn't even talk about my experience for months. Like I couldn't even put it into words. And so these people, the people of this Yongle tribe up there, they're living in a way where their perceptions of self and other and earth are so different to ours that it's hard to even relate, you know? It's hard to communicate. I'll give you an example. Like my experience over there is that these human beings, they have a personal identity, they have a name, they have a personal identity, and then they have their tribal name, and then they have their skin name, they have their totem animals. And it felt like their personal identity made up such a small amount of their consciousness. And these other identifiers, these sort of more collective identifiers, took up a really profound amount of their consciousness.
Like what we were speaking to before, with the mind extending well beyond just mind that's internal. It's the mind of place, spirit of place that permeates and
Totally.
gives us a sense of self.
Totally. And here I am, Jiro, rocking up from Sunny Coast and like walking alongside this guy who's adopted me, and the sort of conversational cues I've got are like, hey, what's your name? What do you like doing? And I'm, this is what I like doing, and I'm just trying to be friendly and strike up conversation. But you just realize that the profound differences. All of my conversation is based upon this I language, right? And it's just all about me, and it's like what I have or what I've done or what I want, and it's just, it's not, it's like it created this awkwardness, like, and then from that point on, I decided to like really shut up and just like still ask questions, but just observe. And I watched how these people's minds were, as you said, of the landscape. They were like of the earth, they were of the tree, they were in the bird that flew overhead, they were in the bees whose honey we're going to harvest, they were in the shooting star that went across the night sky that signaled for us that a turtle just laid its eggs. And then we went there the next day and we found a turtle nest and we ate the eggs there on the beach. And it's like they're living in this multi-dimensional web of belonging. That is what the ancient Vedics called Nidra's web, or like just like the oneness. That's a concept to the Western mind, like interdimensional webs of belonging. Concept. To them, it's just like the isness of their existence. They're in it. They're in it. And it's like even trying to talk about being in it takes you out of it. It's like the Tao that can be spoken is not the Tao. It's like just trying to communicate about that. It's like, so anyway, long story short, man, like I've been on a journey to both understand on a theoretical level different modes and models of existence, right? My early years were like studying like Taoism and Buddhism, just like, okay, what are these different ways of perceiving life? And then I've shifted in my 20s and 30s to having direct experiences, being like, okay, yep, the knowledge is great, but now I want to like feel it. And I think that's what you and I have both got in common, is that we seek out and we create for others experiences in which the theoretical can actually become a felt experience. It can become the truth of one's own experience. And by having so many of these truths, so many of these experiences, I've been able to realize the commonality between all of the wisdom traditions, which all stem from this basic, it's the earth speaking through us, through myth, through metaphor, through the creatures. And that's been I've never articulated it in that way, but that's what I feel it is.
For sure. Yeah, look, much of what you said resonates on a very, very personal level as well, in terms of the path that I have found myself on, the path that has been carrying me, the path that I've been walking. It's looking to a lot of the ancient wisdom traditions and trying to perceive what the core, what the heart of this is. And I couldn't have said it better myself than everything that you've just articulated. It's the wisdom of the earth that is at the core of everything. It's that this Nidra's web that you speak about. It's the interconnectedness and not that difference between the conceptual mind and then just being in it. And when it comes to learning and the stillness, this ties into one of the very first things that we were talking about, practices to help us deepen into this interrelatedness with all of our relations. It's dropping into stillness and learning from the land, off the land. And I love this particular quote, and I've been sitting with this for many moons now, and I'm sure you know the name, Malidoma Patrice Somé, West African medicine man, writer, he's a spiritual elder, and this particular quote is, "One can make the request, teach me about what you know, but the better request is, teach me about what teaches you." So it's pointing to that we can receive information about any sort of truth from an intermediary, but the better request is, what's the source? How do I get to the source and learn directly from that? And for me, I've come to recognize that that is of the earth, and what's the oldest tradition, if you will, or way of knowing that I can tap into. And for me, a large part of that has been shamanism. It's shamanism, it's animism, and these two are inextricably intertwined. So I'd love to know your relationship to shamanism and a little bit about your weaving of this particular path.
Yeah, for sure, bro. I mean, animism first came onto my radar when I was living in Japan, because the Japanese are predominantly Shinto, which is an ancient animistic religion, and then Buddhism came in later to sort of like blend and infuse with it. But this Shinto religion is animistic in the sense that they see a sentience and anima, life force in all things, from the rocks, the rivers, the streams, to all the creatures. And that was my first recognition of that as a belief system. And before that, I was very much indoctrinated by the concept of that a rock was an inert, inanimate thing that had absolutely no life force or anything. And I remember when I was 19, 20 years old, living in Japan, and a spark of remembrance was lit upon hearing my relatives there talk about the life force in a rock or a tree. And it just made perfect sense to me. It made absolutely perfect sense to me. Fast forward a few years down the track, and I remember my first ayahuasca and San Pedro cactus experiences, and these were very much experiences of being communicated with from the earth through intermediaries of these plants. And there was, even then, I would say the word shamanism wasn't yet fully on my radar. But so I believe that I arrived at shamanism the same way that all the original shamanic cultures would have arrived at it, through not having a concept of shamanism, but actually just through a direct communication with the earth, which ties in with my definition of what I perceive as shamanism, as the direct teachings of the earth put into some sort of like format with beautiful lineages in there. But fundamentally, all these human lineages just stack on top of what is fundamentally wisdom of the earth. And I see shamanic practices as being the profound art, the art and science of connecting deeply with the earth and with the soul. And the earth and the soul, like I speak of them as synonymously, because I see our souls as the wild part of ourselves, as the earth. And so this shamanic path, I'm tremendously fascinated by it, and I regard myself as a very humble student of it, and I'm not part of any lineage or anything like that, and I'm fascinated by all of the shamanic cultures and all of what connects them, and it just blows my mind to think that you've got shamanic cultures in West Africa, in like the Inuit shamanic cultures, or in South America, and they've all got common tools like the drum. Like, it just blows me away that all of these cultures have realized the power of rhythm, the power of drum, the power of vibration, the power of offerings, the power of speaking to the plants. there's this common understanding of different dimensions of reality, like the underworld and this world and the upper world. The knowing of the specificity of offerings, like the specificity and the nuance and the artistry that you get in shamanic cultures of how to give back to the earth blows me away. It blows me away. It's like there is so much depth and detail and nuance to it that it's going to be a lifelong practice, just exploring all these shamanic traditions. And I'm just stoked to be a humble student on this path.
Yeah, you and I both.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, it's an amazing
ceremony. And
yeah, go on.
Yeah, it is amazing. What I was going to say is that ceremony and ritual, as you were speaking about, making offerings, all inextricably intertwined with this path that we call shamanism, earth honoring traditions, nature-based spirituality.
Yeah.
So what I was going to pose to you is, aside from the poems and the prayers and the songs that spill forth from the tip of your tongue that had been residing and flowing up through somewhere much, much deeper within you, are there any ceremonial or ritualistic practices that you resonate or are resonating most with today on a daily basis or a weekly basis? Anything that's informing your connection?
The fire, we're just entering into the winter here in this hemisphere, and the sacred fire, man. So I launched an offering, a program, a portal for men about a month ago, called Shambhala Warrior, and this is basically training men to develop this mythical and this shamanic intelligence. And it was the day before I was launching, and I was sat in the sun, notebook on my lap, and I was thinking, there's something I got to do. This is the day before launch. Surely I should be doing something. Surely I should be, like, I don't know, fretting about something or planning something. This is the day before the biggest thing that I've ever launched is launching, and I'm launching it tomorrow. And I just sat there for a while, and then it came to me, like a message came to me. And the message was, get yourself up that mountain, which is a local sacred mountain, a very feminine mountain, and make a fire up the top there the old way. And it was just like boom, and straight away packed my stuff up, drove myself there, hour hike to the top of this mountain, taking my fire making equipment, and I was down on my knees, like doing the old way of fire by friction, creating an ember, birthing an ember, and like making a fire from that very tender ember. And it's a very, very delicate, very, very sacred act of creation, making a fire the old way. And the feeling in my body when that fire was lit was like this overflowing, rapturous feeling of rightness. Of when you do things right, there's a feeling, you know it. When you've done things the right way, when you've made the correct offerings, when you've asked the right blessings and asked permission and given reverence and respect and honor, there's a feeling in your body which is like, it's like nestling into this sweet spot. And I felt that just permeating my being. And so since then, making a fire the old way has become a very profound ritual in my life. And if you think about what's going on when you're making a fire the old way, and I'm talking about fire by friction. So basically, for those who aren't aware, you have a base plate which has a little notch in it, a hole in it, and you have a stick which it could be seen as a very phallic kind of shape going into the hole, and you have a process of friction being created, and when enough heat and consistency and rigor has been displayed, well, then there'll be enough heat for there to be born a tiny, delicate little ember that goes down a birth canal that you've cut into the notch. And it couldn't be more metaphorical for like giving birth to new life. It just couldn't be, right? You got all the parts there, and then you got this delicate ember that you have to like nurture and nourish into before it becomes a flame, like a living flame. it's like this is deep, like fire wisdom, fire intelligence became incepted into me. It got remembered into me just as I was ready to launch this new program, and it was like this piece of ancestral code that I wasn't ready for before that. I wasn't ready for it. Yeah, I'd done fire stuff and I'd sat around fires, but fire took on a whole new meaning for me just in the last month. And so that's one example of something that I'm doing regularly. The other rituals, there's offerings and things like that. A lot of my friends are frequently making beautiful dispatchos and beautiful dispatchos, and that's not a big part of my practice at the moment. But what a big part of my practice is just going by myself to the places that are special to me, whether that's the tree, whether that's the cave, whether that's the beach, whether that's the particular pocket of a particular forest that calls me. And I go there alone, and I sit silently and I make my offerings from my heart, just through my presence, through the quality of my presence. Those are some of the examples of the simplicity of the ceremony and the ritual that I bring, because I feel like we can get caught up in a lot of the intricacies of ceremony, and there's a beauty to that,
the extravaganza.
the extravaganza, and all of a sudden we're like lugging like 17 Tupperware things into a forest so that we can have our Palo Santo and our sage and our sacred cacao and our chocolate and all of the things. And it's just like, okay, ultimately it's just the energy of the heart is what we're giving here, And so another thing that I'll just mention is the practice of prayer, which I'd also just call communication with intention. Communication with intention and reciprocity, with like I'm talking but I'm receiving at the same time. That's what I call prayer, and that's part of my practice, almost on before I go to sleep and when I wake up in the morning. It just is what I do. So yeah, those are some examples. Oh yeah,
when you tell the story, go ahead.
Yeah, just one more that I feel like is important for people. So I've and you're on this. I know that you and I are both inspired by the same person when it comes to some of these practices, bringing sun reverence. Man, I spent hours and hours in the sun, and I feel like, I had my first breakthrough with the sun on a vision quest, which was a north-facing vision quest site, which was quite brutally exposed to the sun. But I just I submitted to the sun. Yeah, and I felt like, what came through to me was that if you're not in some sort of worship or reverence or some very sacred relationship with the sun, well, that's almost psychotic when you drop into the role that the sun plays in our lives, the fact that it is the source of all life. And so I feel like my relationship with the sun has become so much more deep and nuanced, and it's giving back to me in just like immune system strength and power and clarity and conviction and follow through. So yeah, that's another one of my rituals.
Same for me as well. And I think it points out to this deep amnesia as a species that we're carrying when we take a look around, and we can observe that severe disconnect with the daybreak star, with the very essence that gives light and life and warmth to all things. And I love what you were saying about this story of feeling called up to the mountain, and it makes me reflect on tapping into the spirit of place, the mind of place, as we were speaking to. And we all have access to that when we deepen into this path of reconnection or remembrance or the wild wisdom, nature connection, however we want to articulate it. And we start to recognize the aliveness within all things, and this intercommunication that is constantly happening. And I've had many, many experiences like this as well, where there'll be a calling or a tapping into something, a real visceral feeling within. It's like, okay, I'm supposed to go in this direction down to this creek, even though I was going to be going back home, or, you know, whatever. I was going to take this other trail, but instead this particular one's called me. And something very, very, there's no other way to describe it, but magical, mystical. But at the same time, it's not that you would see something externally, but it's an internal knowing. It goes well beyond the rational, logical mind. It's a soul knowing. It's soul language that we are tapping into and intercommunicating with all of life around us. And there's messages to be received. And aside from these particular experiences, something that's just flowing through right now is there any other profound nature type connection experiences, or perhaps narrowing in a little bit more slightly, experiences that have reaffirmed or revealed the depth at which nature is in communion with you and which you are in communion with it?
Oh man, I mean, like, I guess this is the time to talk about the plants, right? I mean, the
For
plants,
sure.
the plants are knocking at the door of this conversation and saying,
Mm-hmm.
uh, "Hey, give us our libation," and I would like to profoundly just honor, and in my life particularly, it's been grandmother ayahuasca, and I'm and the acacia of this continent, but I just pay deep respect to them for the spirits of those plants for just so much. But the one plant that I am in apprenticeship with, that there is just this ever deepening journey that really does feel like an apprenticeship. And I use the word apprenticeship to kind of infer like longevity of and like my sense of humility on this journey of like being apprenticed by a master, and that's Wachuma, the cactus, and this this unfolding journey that I'm part of, with this master teacher, is just been profoundly connective, nature connective. Oh man, like, it's hard to put it even into words, but it's just it's
I
just
do know.
yeah,
Yes.
I know, it's just there's such deep remembrances of the wildness that I am, and such beautiful, beautiful, soft and gentle emergences, like liftings of veils, to be able to perceive the beauty of nature and just the divinity in all of creation. And so that's been a huge part of my practice. And then vision questing, um, so spending nights alone in a wild place with nothing to distract you, not even a book or a journal or a head torch, nothing. Man, it is quite the palate cleanser. It is quite the it wipes away layers and layers and layers of detritus and domestication and convenience and thought forms. And it's been a beautiful, beautiful part of my journey to spend more and more time in wild places and to feel this. It's what it feels like, a very inside out kind of like experience, because you're just taking away everything that like could possibly interfere with a very, very raw interface, like a connection, like swelu, which is that word to connect, where the avatar connects to his beast. It's like there's a rawness to that connection that can get influenced by just things like food. You know, food can become an avoidance thing. Well, what are we avoiding? We're avoiding deep, deep, deep connection. So can conversation, like so can books, so can everything. And when you strip away it all, I just love the barrenness of a vision quest. And I love the simplicity of the fact that you got these three elements to a vision quest. You got the separation, taking yourself away from the normality of life. You got the threshold, which is like the ordeal, like going through some sort of threshold, like going without for a few days, like facing the fear of being alone or dingoes or snakes or whatever it is, or just being with your own mind for 3 days, 4 days. And then there's the return, the reintegration. And I just love the fact that that um, three-part arc of transformation, it's so simple, but it is known. It is that represents the condensation, like the reduction. Like imagine like wisdom being simmered down through tens and tens and tens and tens and tens of thousands of years of ritual, and it's been simmered down to those three things, right? And that's what a vision quest represents. And so of course it's going to be a very, very powerful experience of death and rebirth, and it's going to completely like help you shed your skin and remember the truth of what you are and connect with the wild parts within you in profound ways. I'm blown away by the simplicity but yet the power of the wilderness vigil. So yeah.
Yeah, again, you're speaking my language, and I feel like we could riff on this for ages, but you're actually getting me real G'd up to also finish up with our conversation so I can go and spend some time outside.
Yeah, man.
I'm alone right now and the family isn't home, so as soon as we're done here, it's outside, and I might go bring my drum or the yadaki, the didgeridoo, and maybe go for a walk down the creek. I've made a very, very special little friend down at the creek, and I won't say what that friend, what that ally is, but there are just some things that aren't, well, they're too close to the heart to be shared, and I know you understand that and appreciate that. But yeah, made a beautiful little ally over the past few weeks, going down and making my own offerings, my own libations in the form of prayer, poem, song, little nature mandalas on the ground. So I'm keen to do that. But before we wrap up, is there anything else that you wanted to touch on in regards to Shambhala Warriors?
No, man. I mean, like, I know that this is the part of the podcast where people are always like, do you want to share your links and where people can find you? And it's like, sure. JiroTaylor.com is where my work is centered. I do run a program for men who are walking this pathless path of the heart. In a nutshell, I help men who are stepping into their truth. I help them shift their lives and their businesses in ways that really contribute to that truth, contribute to the expression of that truth. So I call it Shambhala Warrior in reference to an ancient prophecy about the people stepping up to be the change. And so yeah, you can find information about that on at JiroTaylor.com or connect with me on the usual social channels.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, there are a bunch of other threads that I would have loved to have gotten into, but maybe that's
part two, bro.
We'll let them simmer for another. Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, so Jiro, brother, thanks so much for joining me. I had a blast riffing on all things and many things that I haven't actually articulated before. So trusting that they have come through with some ounce of clarity or cohesion or coherence and that the listeners will be able to find, I'm trusting that there'll be value in our conversation for people to carry with them on their own path forward. But lastly, just as we open up the space with your beautiful story, I'd love to invite you to share something to close down our space together in the same light of honoring the sacred, whether it's story, poem, prayer, song, words of gratitude, anything that you feel called to share.
Yeah, I feel called to for us to close our eyes. And if you're listening to this, please close your eyes. And I feel called to honor the ancestors of the land on which all of us sit, whether you're sitting in Europe or the Americas, or whether you're sitting in this ancient continent of Australia. I'm sitting right now on the land that was cared for many years by the Gubbi Gubbi people. So I pay my respect to them. And I'd like to just give thanks to Mother Earth, Pachamama, the sun, the moon, all beings all creatures in service to deep thanks and honor and reverence for all of life. Aho, ma.
Aho and ma. Yeah. Thanks again for joining me on Birdsong, Jiro. It's much appreciated you taking some time out of your day, brother.
Much love, brother.